welcome. Today is a dark and stormy night, and someone is wrong on the internet. Shocking.
Terrible.
I
Should be illegal.
was searching through my copy of Wikipedia.
Oh, is that the one anyone can edit?
Anyone can edit this. It's written in pencil.
You just erase it and put it whatever you want to say.
Yes. Yes, anyone can do it. And I was searching through infantry in the American Civil War. Shocking, I know. And there were some interesting misconceptions because the entire article quoted but one historian. It went on and on and on using quotes from this one historian. Alan C. Guelzo. Would love to duel Alan C. Guelzo. Pistols or swords or tomahawks, fine by me. You have a more civil response to him, but we'll get to that. It goes on and on quoting from Guelzo, and we would like to address some of the misconceptions floating from this professor and from those of his school of thought regarding the rifle musket. Professor Guelzo contends that rifle muskets did not revolutionize land warfare due to a combination of inadequate firearms training and poor visibility caused by black powder. The fog of war merely took over the entire Civil War. It was just a big cloudy fog that you just couldn't see for 4 years. Couldn't see the whole thing. So Captain Gibbons, tell us what you think about Professor Guelzo and those of his ilk.
Well, I am drinking Canadian whiskey because I want to be polite and inoffensive in my commentary over Dr. Guelzo's remarks, but I would disagree with him very much that the rifle musket did not revolutionize warfare. I think that was proven decisively in the Crimea when the British turned warfare upside down. We did a conversation on that recently. And that was 1854, 1855. The Russian sources remarked at how disadvantaged they were. The British sources observed how powerful this new weapon was, and for Dr. Guelzo to say that the rifle musket did not revolutionize warfare is, I think, respectfully, that he's focusing too much on the rifle musket's role in the American Civil War, which is a unique context. I do not believe the rifle musket was used even close to its inherent capabilities during the American Civil War.
All right. Well, speaking of capabilities, let's address one of the first things mentioned here. The technical difficulty of aiming a rifle musket at longer ranges. While rifling improved overall accuracy of muskets, the rifling also formed a trajectory that caused the bullet to quickly drop, my God, from where it was aimed, in contrast with the flat trajectory of smoothbore muskets fired at close range. Thus, to hit a target at distances beyond 40 to 50 yards, the rifleman would require knowledge of trajectory and distance, aiming the rifle at a precise angle above the target. In actual battlefield situations, such precise aiming was virtually impossible. Interesting. So not only does Bess here have a completely flat trajectory at 40 to 50 yards, she just no drop, none at all.
Laser beam.
Laser beam, yes. Future weapon. Future weapon right here. This is the musket of the future, people. Order your brown Bess today. But he's saying that the rainbow arc is simply precludes people from effectively using it. No?
Yeah, I think he's following in the a scholarly tradition of historians like Paddy Griffiths and Earl Hess, and Paddy Griffith was a British historian, was the first to make the then controversial argument that Civil War battles with rifles were not fought at rifle ranges, like 400 or 500 yards, even though the weapons were capable of that. His research conclusively, and I agree with him, proved that it was the average range of a firefight was about 140 yards. And from that, he determined that the rifle musket was too difficult for the average soldier, the average Civil War soldier to use, and therefore it wasn't a decisive weapon. Earl Hess made the same argument, and it sounds like Dr. Guelzo is following in that tradition. But to go to the extent to say that it did not revolutionize warfare is, again, I think they're focusing on the context of the American Civil War and ignoring the rest. I think that 40 to 50 yard phrase came from the book of Wikipedia.
Yes.
And I hope not from Dr. Guelzo. I don't think that's something that he would have written.
Well, again, the article does go on with
that's
referencing.
Patently absurd.
Yes.
It is true that there is a rainbow trajectory of a rifle musket, and at very, very close ranges, the smoothbore musket had a flatter trajectory. We're talking at point blank, level your fire lock and haul back on the trigger, just by virtue of the powder charge it had, and there's no windage in the barrel. The important difference is that round ball is coming out of the musket. Yeah, it might have a flat trajectory, but you have no control. The soldier has no control over where that bullet is going beyond a general direction where he is, quote unquote, aiming. Most soldiers with flintlock muskets, they would look away because they didn't want the flash in the pan singeing their eyes. So he just, like Colonel Wilford, the chief instructor of the School of Musketry that the British Army set up, said that the soldiers have been taught for 100 years, you'd open your mouth, look away, and haul back on the trigger, and wherever the bullet goes, it goes.
And firing a charge of 6 drams, they probably should have.
Well, yes, and that was due to the enormous windage in the barrel. You needed that enormous charge of powder to get the bullet out and send it with some velocity. But yeah, it's patently absurd that you can't hit anything beyond 40 or 50 yards because of the rainbow arc. If for instance you have a pattern 53 rifle musket, and this is a original first model 1853 rifle musket, and the lowest sight setting is 100 yards. That's as low as you can get it. But if you aim center mass at 100 yards and aim at a soldier 100 yards away, you will hit him every time without question. The trajectory in 100 yards, the ball falls 1 foot 5 inches. So if you set your sights at 100 yards, the sights compensate for that. The rifle in the sight was designed knowing the ball will fall 1 foot 5 inches in 100 yards. So if you aim center mass at 100 yards, you will hit where you aim at 100 yards, and the ball will continue going for 95 more yards. So if you set your sights to 100 and the soldier's at 150 yards and you fire at him, you're going to hit him in the knees. So the assertion that at beyond 40 or 50 yards, the rifle musket's useless unless the soldier delicately sets his sights, it's ludicrous on the face of it. And honestly, even by, the book of Wikipedia standards, it's ludicrous on the face of it.
Well, now, one thing that we do agree with is that there was no training. And we know that the emphasis was not on individual marksmanship, as it was in the British Army at the time. Is that simply a lack of emphasis on it in a volunteer army? Is it because it's not a priority? Because they have so many of these people coming in? Or is it simply that the entire American all the Americans don't have an emphasis on musketry for the individual soldier.
Yes.
All of that.
All of the above.
All of that.
Yes. Now you consider the context of the American Civil War. The United States Army, the standing army for the United States, let's correct me, 14,000, 16,000
Somewhere
soldiers.
thereabouts.
It was ridiculously, absurdly small by European standards. The British in this context are having an invasion scare from France, and so they're raising volunteer regiments. Every British gentleman's duty is to buy a rifle and train with it. Volunteer rifle clubs are very popular. All of this strongly supported by the British government. The British government provided the weapons, provided ample ammunition at very low cost. And in the American context, there's no foreign threat. There's no fear of invasion. We're mostly fighting Native American conflicts on the frontier. There's no foreign army going to march in. So we had a very small army that had just recently been equipped with a new rifle, the model 1855, which was an excellent rifle. It had sights that went out to 1,000 yards. But there was no large-scale, widespread emphasis on musketry instruction. And then the American Civil War breaks out, and suddenly there's hundreds of thousands of men joining armies. First of all, there's not enough rifles. So even if Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln are jumping up and down saying, "I want a full musketry instruction like the British have for our armies," they'd say, "Well, Mr. President, we don't have enough rifles." First of all. Second, there's not enough ammunition. You had an army of 15,000 men, and now you have an army of 500,000. You know, Lincoln, how many volunteers did he call for? Like 75,000.
Yes, right away.
And they don't even have muskets for them. They're issuing them, Hall rifles and Model 1842 smoothbores and old 1816 flintlock conversions. They're just anything that shoots, and they're raising these regiments on the field. And they're drawing men that have no military background. There's this misconception that the American in the 1860s was out, hunting squirrels, and he could shoot the eye out of a squirrel at, 50 paces with his Kentucky rifle. Assuming, for sake of argument, that was true, you don't need to estimate distance when you're plinking at squirrels at 50 yards. You don't need an aiming drill. You don't need a position drill. You're not reloading and firing rapidly. You're just going out and plinking with your rifle. And most Civil War soldiers, I would argue, came from an urban context. So they're working in the North. Many of them coming from Ireland, where you weren't even allowed to own a firearm, come to the United States, and they end up enlisting in the Union Army. No firearms experience. And their officers are generally the same way, no firearms experience. So there's
No, but did anyone with military experience push for a school of musketry type situation?
Very few. Confederate, an officer who would become a Confederate general, Harry Heath, was actually instrumental in adopting the model 1855 rifle. He was part of the experiments at Harper's Ferry, deciding how many grooves is the best configuration, should we do progressive rifling or not, what type of lock should we adopt. He was involved in the adoption of the rifle and had studied foreign rifles. And there was a federal lieutenant, Cadmus Wilcox, who published a book on rifle shooting. And in the standing Federal Army before the Civil War, there were sharpshooter awards and prizes that you could win if you were the best shot in the company. They were doing some limited musketry training.
The prize was the stadiometric rangefinder,
little gilt stadiometric silver rangefinder was actually prescribed by regulation. But again, we can assume, for sake of argument, let's say every soldier in this 15,000-man standing army was a trained shot. Once you're raising these volunteer regiments, what are you going to do? You're going to send one or two to every single regiment to try to train soldiers, and then with what? With muskets, with smoothbores. And that was the problem in the American Civil War. That's why I argue the American Civil War is not the best context to evaluate how revolutionary the introduction of the first rifle as an infantry weapon was. You're starting with inexperienced volunteers, with inexperienced volunteer officers that in many cases had to be taught right alongside their men. There's a lack of ammunition. Even if a colonel like General Claiborne in the Confederate Army was a strong proponent of marksmanship training, but they did not have the sheer volume of ammunition that you needed, at least at the start of the war, as opposed to the British, who had by 1860, not only was the Royal Laboratory at Woolwich producing large amounts of quality ammunition, but there were private manufacturers making it, and to the delight of the Confederates, were more than happy to sell the Confederate purchasing agent. So the Confederates found themselves fairly early in the American Civil War with excellent English-made rifle ammunition that they eventually would copy.
It was those tiny child hands that were able to produce so many rounds.
The British Enfield cartridge that was more complex than the American cartridge to create, to make these. But they could, just by their inherent function, you could load and fire them even hundreds of times, whereas the American standard, the Burton bullet would foul your barrel up after 15 to 20 shots.
Because it was so close in the size.
Yes, it had very little windage. It was a tight fit in the barrel. It was easy to produce. The only thing you had to produce with any precision was the bullet itself. And I think this is something we were going to discuss in a future video.
We'll definitely get to that later. Because we always like to compare America and Britain. Now, since I always love to compare America and Britain, I would like to read the contrast between, an army that simply wants to send out a volunteer. He will learn on the go, as it were, and we don't need to treat him as a professional soldier, as an individual infantryman. He's merely part of the machine. Whereas in the British service,
it's Colonel Wilford.
This is Colonel Wilford. A man cannot be made to hit a mark against his will. In fact, he fires with his brains, the eye and finger being merely servants of the mind. To succeed or to excel, there must be love in the heart and knowledge in the head. But no man can be interested in that which he cannot understand. Hence, each soldier is made to comprehend the laws which influence the bullet in its flight, and how to apply this knowledge to practice. He is led to think, and his moral character is found to be improved and elevated thereby. He becomes conscious of his increased efficiency and value. He is raised from a mere machine, a trigger puller, a throwaway of fire, and, after instruction, is not merely a good but an intelligent shot.
Colonel Wilford is describing the modern soldier.
Yes.
Because again, the British Army had armed itself with the first infantry rifle. And the difference between the rifle and the smoothbore is it takes no intelligence just to robotically, a mere trigger puller, just...
But there's something in the culture of the British Army, is there not, that you have a professional American army before the Civil War, and there's no emphasis on the individual marksmanship.
Not remotely close to that of the British Army, no. And, keep in mind, in the 1860s, there's still a stigma in the United States against a standing army is not a thing we want. Promotions were very slow, so you're not attracting the best and brightest officers. You'll sit as a lieutenant for 15 years. The British Army, as Colonel Wilford said, is taking soldiers and teaching them the most fundamental, what you could argue, the most fundamental trait of a soldier, how to engage and defeat his enemy. And for the first time, you could argue in warfare, with some precursors, you could say, to the English longbowman, but now it's no longer simply maneuvering 60,000 men to the right position at the right time with smooth-bore muskets. Now it's up to the individual soldier's proficiency is what wins the battles for you, what wins the wars for you. And that elevated the importance of the soldier from being a mere robot trigger puller to a more valuable member of the team, kind of the way we see soldiers today. And today as well, the individual soldier with his or her individual rifle takes aim and engages an individual target with a rifle. The same exact thing that the British soldiers were doing in contemporary to the American Civil War. And we in the United States, for various reasons, did not do that. And you could argue it's because there weren't enough rifles, because we were volunteers, we didn't have the experience. But to get back to the thesis we've stated at the beginning, to say that the rifle musket did not revolutionize warfare is...
because people can still hit, between 1 and 300 yards without much range estimation, no?
1 and 200 yards.
1 and 200.
Once you get to 300, for instance, if you set your sights to 200 yards and you aim at a target at 300 yards with like a P-53 rifle, you'll miss them. And vice versa, if the target's at 300 yards and you set your sights to 400, you will miss him. The ball will go either over his head or it will fall to the ground in front of him. So under 200, and that's why the average range Patty Griffiths determined in the American Civil War, 143 yards, because that's the range where even with a rifled musket, you can't miss. Anything beyond that range requires some degree of training. And
it's absolutely ludicrous that 40 to 50 yards, is the only
that's ludicrous.
The only capability of this weapon. So the other thing that we wanted to talk about was, yes, there is a not much ammunition to go around to be wasted because the priority isn't there on target practice. But this argument is an additional limitation on unlocking the potential of the rifle was the availability of gunpowder and the pursuant lack of training prior to the development of industrialized chemical plants producing copious amounts of gunpowder in the mid-19th centuries. There were multiple 19th centuries, by the way. 19th centuries.
Wow.
Armies simply could not expend large amounts of gunpowder for training. As a result, the average infantryman simply did not have extensive firearms training beyond simple maintenance and loading drills. Would you say it's out of necessity or out of priority for both armies?
Yes. Again, all of the above, but what the assumption here, and I'm assuming whoever wrote this Wikipedia article in pencil in your book,
yes,
was probably American, and therefore assumed that the Civil War is the primary focus, the only context to judge rifle muskets. So when he says that 19th century armies couldn't train because there wasn't enough gunpowder, I just...
Crimea never happened, the Indian Mutiny never happened, the War of the
and bear in mind,
Prussian-Austrian War never happened.
Where is it?
The Prussians never went into Schleswig.
This is a reprint, because an original is rather dear, but it's a reprint of the first instruction of musketry regulation for the British Army. This is January 1856, so that's 5 years before Fort Sumter and Bull Run. And British soldiers, every single year, British soldiers would fire 90 rounds with their assigned rifle in an annual qualification out to ranges out to 900 yards. And they fired this every year, starting in 1856. And the School of Musketry by 1856 had already been established now for 4 years. And you've got veterans of the Crimea coming back and adding this knowledge to the professional British Army.
Now, in contrast, Captain Gibbons, how many rounds does the average soldier expend in a qualification round in the American Army today?
Well, the average qualification, every qualification is 40 rounds. The
Right.
standard table, this is assuming with the M16 or M4 carbine, you fire 40 rounds in your qualification. You're
And
given,
how many was the British in
they're
56?
firing 90 rounds in qualification. Now also bear in mind the United States Army and the Marines are a little different. The Marines, I understand, fire out to a little farther.
Because they're aboard ships and the ship moves.
Well,
Is that not what the Marines do anymore?
probably the Marines are
all right.
a higher life form that I try to avoid when I'm on Pendleton. But the American Army rifle qualification, 40 rounds, and the farthest you shoot at is 300 meters. And the British in 1856 are firing 90 rounds per man out to 900 yards. This is why I cannot understand why someone would make the argument that the introduction of the rifle, this is the first rifle in military use. I said this did not revolutionize warfare. And
In general military use,
in
as
general,
the main
it
infantry
is
weapon,
the sole
not
arm
merely
of
as
the
a
army,
skirmishing
not just-
tool
Correct.
or with specialized rifle troops.
And
This is the everyman's weapon.
And the British and the United States as well had, in fact, the machinery that the British were using to make their bullets and to make their rifles were made in the United States. They were buying our machinery. Commercial manufacturers such as the Ely brothers or Ludlow were producing millions and millions of cartridges a year, and the Royal Laboratory at Woolwich, millions and millions of cartridges a year. The British had several powder mills producing tons and tons and tons of powder on a mass-produced scale. And to say there's not enough ammunition for the soldiers to shoot is true only in the unique American context, where we had a small standing army. You didn't need a large military infrastructure. You didn't have all these powder mills and arsenals and depots set up, because you're only supporting a small army. You only need, so many tens of thousands of cartridges a year for 15,000.
But did both sides have the capability, the technology to make gunpowder?
They certainly could have, yes, and they did very quickly. The case in point is the Confederates, who started with nothing, and within a span of only a very few months, particularly the Augusta Arsenal was producing vast amounts of gunpowder. And, the saying went, the Confederate Army was never for want of powder. They often didn't have shoes. They often didn't have enough food.
There's our Heath again.
Yes.
Yes.
But go and get those shoes.
But it's not this lost knowledge that we simply cannot produce gunpowder to fuel this war. It's merely a matter of priorities, is it not?
Yes.
All
It's
right.
someone on, penciling in the Wikipedia.
Yes, that's yes.
Just.
And to think it all fits in this
solidly-
book.
It does. All of Wikipedia.
Yes.
Well, that's just one of the volumes.
Yes. So now let me read you more of this.
Oh.
Guelzo doubts that contemporary military leaders blatantly ignored technological advances. Rather, Guelzo argued that in actual battlefield conditions, until the development of smokeless powder, the benefits of rifling were largely nullified. Therefore, generals did not alter their tactics, not due to ignorance, but because the battlefield had not changed substantially from the Napoleonic era. Wow. So there's it's a little bit to unpack in that.
General, what was his name? Somonov, leading the attack on Inkerman, would
Yes.
have strongly disagreed
Yes.
with Dr. Guelzo, who, by the way, General Somonov did not come back from the assault on Inkerman.
And that'll be in our Inkerman episode.
He at least had
Coming up.
had the decency to get killed on his disastrous charge.
So let's unpack this. until smokeless powder, no one can see on the battlefield, basically. And military leaders ignored the technological advances.
And again, I have to respectfully disagree. The Civil War generals knew about the technological advances, and even if they wanted to, they could not in a very short period of time. The School of Musketry, for instance, was several months long, and it had a fairly limited class size. And the concept was, over several years, we're going to bring British officers and NCOs to the School of Musketry. We'll train them on marksmanship, and then they will go back to their units and train their soldiers. So it was a deliberate percolation, so that in time this knowledge will spread throughout the British Army. Even if a Union general, even if General Grant in 1864 said, yeah, we're going to do musketry instruction. Well, how? You don't have the time. You're fighting the war now, so you fight the war with the army you have, not the army you wish you had. And it's not that they ignored the rifle musket and its capabilities. It's that they didn't have the time and the resources to harness it. McClellan was an observer in the Crimean War. He would have watched these British riflemen silencing Russian artillery batteries at 600 yards. He would have heard about the 93rd Highlanders stopping in a thin red line,
He wasn't paying attention.
Stopping a cavalry charge.
He couldn't see over the parapet.
What he took away from that, and this is maybe another subject for another talk, was he took away the logistical lessons from the Crimea of how not to do a war. And I could think it would be argued if he had the time and resources, he would have wanted musketry training. But to say that they disregarded the rifle musket and decided pig-headedly to fight the war the way they always have because they didn't feel like the rifle musket was that important. That is as absurd on its face as the 40-yard trajectory.
They are changing what they're doing based on the fact that they have the rifle musket and not a smoothbore. I mean, they are making minute changes. I mean, it's not exactly Napoleonic, is it not?
Not exactly. The engagement ranges are a little farther away, and I think it increased the power of the defense, and that's why I think Lee was able to hold out at Petersburg as long as he did, because the trenches were fairly close and he had rifles.
And people know that as you close that distance, as you lose that rainbow arc, the volley becomes more deadly.
Yes, but bear in mind, you have these Civil War officers. You have an army of volunteers, inexperienced, and they have a weapon in their hands that has a theoretical capability that they do not know how to use. So if you're a Civil War general, you don't stick with Napoleonic tactics because you don't think the rifle musket is important or that it's a combat multiplier. You stick with Napoleonic tactics because you have an army of people who don't know how to use the weapon they're assigned. And you could do the same thing today. You could take a Boy Scout troop and say, congratulations, you're now a volunteer infantry regiment, and you could hand them all M4 carbines, and they're not going to suddenly be the equal of an army infantry unit. Just because you have a modern weapon doesn't mean you know how to use it in the least. I don't think they disregarded the rifle musket and its effectiveness. I think they fought the war with the army that they had, and to the frustration of Harry Heath and General Claiborne and others, there was no opportunity to sit back and train on musketry the way they would have liked. And there's no secret what the British were doing. In fact, several American musketry manuals were just completely plagiarized copies of the British ones. There was no secret, but you have to train up an army in it, and unfortunately, because of the unique circumstances of the Civil War, how fast these massive armies were created, they didn't use the weapon, the rifle musket, to its capabilities, and this has led to the false conclusion that the rifle musket itself somehow wasn't up to the challenge of changing war, and we had to wait for smokeless powder. And that defies the experience of a rifle musket in the Crimean War, where you had a professional army, well trained in its use, employing this weapon to the catastrophic defeat of the Russians. Every time the Russians came out of Sevastopol, they got bloody noses, or worse, at the hands of the rifle, at long range, at 600 and 800 yards.
Now, our Wikipedia friends are placing smokeless powder on a pedestal for the next one too. Engagements necessarily took place with massed lines of infantry at ranges of around 100 yards, 140, for the simple fact the enemy could not be seen at longer distances, since neither side employed smokeless powder in their weapons. So there was this fog of war. Yes. Could not be seen.
Yes, but unless the air is absolutely dense and still, the smoke would move. We're both very experienced with Civil War reenacting and extensive live fire of black powder weapons. And something I have noticed, using gunpowder that is made to the period specification, using like a willow wood or dogwood charcoal instead of...
Not that you would be making your own gunpowder in the backyard.
Oh, heavens, no. No, that would be illegal. I wouldn't do that. But powder made to the period, I guess, recipe, you could say, produced less smoke. And that's something I've observed repeatedly. Modern commercial powders produce a lot more smoke because they're made for different reasons. They're not made for a battlefield. They're made for consistency, batch to batch to batch to batch, for people who are using them for modern target shooting. That makes commercial sense. How much smoke they produced versus modern, whether the composition of the powder made that big of a difference, debatable. But the British in the Crimea certainly were not frustrated. The 93rd fired 3 volleys at charging Russian cavalry, and not once in any period account did they say, well, we fired once at 600 yards and darn if we couldn't shoot again because we couldn't see.
There was just this giant fog that moved in. And this, I mean, there's so much to unpack here, but I mean, even this doesn't address the first volley. Before there's any shooting, you apparently can't shoot at 100 yards. More than 100 yards.
I think the smoke and the fog of war and the chaos of battle is it's kind of entered our lexicon of Napoleonic era battles, and it's assumed to be so very smoky and I don't think it's a sound argument for saying, oh, rifles were useless until smokeless powder because of all the smoke they made. It almost sounds like an easy,
yes,
an easy way out to try to explain something away.
Now, you'll love this one.
Uh-oh.
The black powder itself quickly packed the rifle grooves with residue from firing, and the need to load the rifle by ramming home each charge from the muzzle with a ramrod whose banging around chipped and nicked the muzzle at every point to where the bullet was expelled, further degrading the accuracy of the rifle in use. So there's 2 things to unpack there. One, apparently the ramrod just destroys the rifle musket one nick and chip at a time. And the second thing is that the residue gets in the rifling.
Yes, the residue does, and it's even worse with you could make the argument that with American ammunition, yes, eventually it would. The American Minier style bullet, which Civil War soldiers persisted in calling them mini balls, even though they were not truly Minier. It was the Burton ball, but it externally, superficially resembled the mini ball. And again, I'm sure we'll cover this in more detail in the future. But since it was a very tight-fitting bullet, by necessity, because it had no expanding plug, it had to, the expansion it received was purely from the discharge of the powder, and so it expanded relatively little on its own, so it had to be fit very tight. And after you fired several rounds through any black powder weapon with actual black powder, yes, that fouling is going to start to build up in your grooves. But with an expanding ball, this isn't a smooth bore. This isn't a round ball just bouncing down the barrel, and the powder can just cake up along the sides of the bore. The bullet is expanding, and once it is expanded into the rifling, it is scraping out the fouling that is in front of it, because that bullet has expanded into the groove. So to say that the grooves will fill up with powder, and I'm kind of going at lengths to try to maybe explain what they're getting at. The Burton bullet, the American version of the mini ball, took about 10 or 12 inches going down the barrel until it fully expanded, because it's only expanding with the pressure of the charge. So the gunpowder starts to burn. It's not a modern smokeless powder. It burns at what by modern standards is a very slow rate. And as it starts to burn, it's building pressure in the barrel, and it's pushing the bullet down, but it's not enough pressure to force that bullet to expand yet, until more of the powder is burned and the pressure in the barrel reaches a point that it expands that Burton bullet into the rifling. So maybe they're describing the last 10 to 16 inches of the barrel gets filled with fouling, which for the American is true. But there was an alternative. The British ammunition used a plug in the base, a very light plug, and I think it required maybe 2 or 3 inches as this bullet was traveling down the barrel before that the lighter plug, by the laws of Newtonian physics, the lighter plug really wants to move, and so it plows itself into this heavy bullet that does not want to move and expands it into the rifling while still at the breech. You could fire hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of infield cartridges.
And you have?
I have. We have fired 201 consecutive rounds without stopping to fire with the British ammunition. So maybe with American ammunition, yeah, you could argue that the Burton bullet with its slower expansion would start to fill the grooves.
So then you might just need to use a rock to tap your bullet in. It wouldn't suddenly turn your rifle into a smoothbore.
No, it would not. Not in the amount of rounds typically you would expect in a...
Now let's talk about the ramrod, the enemy of the Rifle-Musket, apparently. Because you have the correct ramrod in that,
yes,
that P53.
This is a first model
Now
P53.
this was in the Crimean, no?
Yes, this was this particular rifle was made in 1854. So it is right now about 164 years old. Almost assuredly went to the Crimean, because it's one of the first 24,000 P53 infield rifles that were made, and they were rushed off to the Crimea as soon as possible. And it was also arsenal refinished at Pimlico in 1861, which suggests that it had a life of hard service. So if it had stayed back in England as you know, some centuries rifle or something, you wouldn't expect it to have it's so rough handling that it would need to be arsenal refinished. And I shot this yesterday, and this is a 164-year-old rifle that has seen hard military service, and I was hitting a steel target at 300 yards, and this was the first time I fired it. And the rifling is very good. Even at the bore, there's crisp, defined rifling. So the argument that soldiers using their ramrods are going to what did he say happens to it?
It's chipped and nicked the muzzle at the very point where the bullet was expelled.
It is true that the crown of a rifle barrel is the most important parts of a rifle is where the bullet enters the rifling and where it leaves. That is true. A chipped and nicked crown is going to affect the bullet's terminal trajectory once it leaves your barrel. But it's not going to turn the rifle from an accurate weapon into a useless smoothbore if the crown is a little worn. Ramrods are very hard on muzzles. I'm not saying that they're not. Keep in mind that the ramrods were made. The head of the ramrod is made of a softer iron, while the rest of the ramrod is made out of steel. So
which is not true of most reproductions.
No, that's correct. But this is an original with the original correct swell ramrod. The head is treated so that it's a softer metal, so that it causes less harm to the barrel as you're ramming. And the British Army went to lengths to train their soldiers to be very careful in ramming, to ram straight down, and even to incline their knuckles to the right while they're ramming, so that the bullet, as it's being rammed, starts to already follow in the grooves of the rifling. Something you don't see in the United States at all. And now bear in mind, American soldiers in these early Civil War battles, many of them never even fired a rifle musket to begin with. So I'm sure they are rough on their rifles and not really taking much care of the crown. But just the fact that this is a 164-year-old rifle that saw hard wartime service with the original barrel, and it has the original lock with that lovely, graceful little curl, that little concession to aesthetics that they made on the first model Enfield that I love. The crown is fine. It's seen service. It's worn. It's not factory new, but I don't understand why they would even bring it up.
I can't possibly.
Caked with fouling, and the rifle musket solved the fouling issue with the Enfield cartridge. You could fire them 200 plus times with reasonable expectations of accuracy. Again, I think the context is focused on the American Civil War.
Do you get fouling just as easily in a smoothbore? I mean, there is fouling in smoothbore.
Yes, but the bullets are so generously undersized that
in the British Army,
it could be well fouled and you can still get the bullet down. And that was the whole point of having a very small bullet and a very large charge of powder.
though with flintlock rifles, you also have bullets that are very close to the caliber of the bore. Do you know?
Like a flintlock rifle, like an earlier, like a Kentucky style rifle,
Mm-hmm.
or a Baker rifle.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but those were typically loaded with a patch, and that was as expanded into the rifling at the muzzle while you were loading it as it was when you fired it. It wasn't an expanding ball, and it required a lot of effort to load. That's why they weren't adopted as the general infantry weapon, because you could fire that round S 4 or 5 times in the time it took a rifleman to get one shot off of a patched round ball out of his Baker rifle, or out of a Kentucky style American rifle. But the Rifle-Musket was used ammunition that expanded, like the British Pritchett bullet, or the American Burton bullet. It expanded itself when you fired it. So it was as quick and easy to load as the smoothbore musket.
Dare I touch upon the Williams bullet?
Want to go down that rabbit hole?
Or is that a story for another day?
We could, just briefly.
Because the Union did have an expanding bullet.
Well, the Burton bullet was expanding. It just took its time. The Williams bullet which has been butchered. Everyone has called the Williams cleaner bullet. Incorrectly, it was never referred to that historically, least of all by its inventor. But it was designed to expand more rapidly on firing, and a bullet that expands itself into the rifling grooves when it fires is going to scrape out the fouling of the shot before it. So it's going to have this self-cleaning type of mechanism. Same thing that the British Pritchett bullet had. But the American Ordnance Board of Ordnance realized that the Burton bullet caused all this fouling, and they adopted the millions and millions and millions of Williams bullets that the soldiers didn't like, in an attempt to clean their barrels out a little more thoroughly than with Burton's bullet.
Now this one, we'll have to get a big basket ready because there's a lot of cherry picking. And he actually quotes an Englishman, if you can believe it. Guelzo quotes Lieutenant Andrew Steinmetz, first class shot at the School of Musketry, for predicting the smoke and chaos of battle means soldiers won't be able to aim at long range. Steinmetz wrote, he uses him for smoke and chaos of battle means soldiers won't be able to aim at long range. But he goes on to say, in spite of the defects of rifles and rifled cannon, owing to the great curvature of their trajectory, it is certain that we cannot do without them. An army with smoothbore muskets and cannon before an army armed with rifles and rifled cannon would be in a sorry plight. Its batteries would be smashed, its skirmishers picked off and annihilated at ranges where its balls would be harmless, while its lines and reserves must be kept at a most respectful distance. So, again, cherry picking a quote about the smoke, which was somehow this was the Third Army in the American Civil War, according to Guelzo. The smoke, there was the Union, the Confederates, and then the smoke. Had to fight the smoke.
I'd find it interesting that Dr. Guelzo has if he wants to quote British sources, he would have had to dig to find this Lieutenant Steinmetz, and this was a United Service Journal article that he wrote, and half of the article was about calisthenics in use in the French army, and then the second half of the article, I want to say it was 1861 when the article was written, is the Rifle-Musket in war, and he actually makes some observant remarks. The School of Musketry and the musketry training in the British Army was very, on England's green and pleasant land, this works very well. You can take soldiers and you can shoot out to 900 yards. And Lieutenant Steinmetz is saying, on an actual battlefield, we need to be careful because a lot of the stuff we're teaching is in a kind of classroom setting in England's green and pleasant land, target shooting, target range sort of environment. He says, we're doing ourselves a disservice assuming this is going to keep us safe, because real battle is smoke. That's what Dr. Guelzo sees upon, but smoke and chaos, and people are shooting back at you. And are you really going to be able to accurately estimate the distance of the enemy and remember all the shooting that they taught you at Hythe or in the instruction of musketry at your unit? Are you going to remember all of that effectively and employ that effectively in actual battle? So he's giving a warning that makes sense. War isn't all beer and skittles where you march out in your nice uniforms and you shoot the enemy from 900 yards away and then you go to tea. He's saying, war is nasty, dirty, chaotic, and we need to prepare for that. What Lieutenant Steinmetz was not doing is throwing the baby out with the bathwater, like in the subsequent quote you read. If Dr. Guelzo had proceeded a little further, would have read that, and even Lieutenant Steinmetz agrees that a formation armed with rifles against a formation with smoothbores, as was the case in the Crimean War, the one with the rifles are just going to walk all over the smoothbore armed forces. And I think you could, by extension, make the same argument for a army with rifles that is trained on them is going to walk all over an army armed with rifles that is not trained on them. So I do not think Lieutenant Steinmetz is making the argument that Dr. Gilzo projects upon him that, yeah, why are we even bothering with all the School of Musketry stuff? The trajectory of the rifle is too hard to comprehend. Soldiers aren't going to remember this in battle. The stuff that soldiers today, that we are trained to remember in battle, is so vastly more extensive and complex than what a soldier in 1860 would be expected to remember to do in battle. As technology increases, warfare gets increasingly more complex, and the soldier has to keep catching up to that. They couldn't have imagined, radios and indirect fire and crew serve weapons and the choreography of clearing rooms or things like that. What they were doing in the 1860s is, by modern standards, fairly simple. So I think, yes, you can expect soldiers today have to adjust the sights on their weapons for the range of the enemy that they're engaging. And they somehow manage to do that without, throwing their hands in the air and saying, this isn't working, give me a smoothbore. So I don't really see where Dr. Guelzo was going with his argument. Other than if you strictly limit it to the American Civil War, yeah, okay. But there's a much broader context. If you make an argument like the Rifle-Musket did not revolutionize warfare, you cannot simply use the American Civil War as the source of all your data. Respectfully.
Respectfully.
Yes, respectfully.
So to sum up, the story is a little more complicated than some people would have it be. The Rifle-Musket is, if not the most pivotal, a major factor in the American Civil War and certainly changed warfare in the 19th century. I always like to sum up with some questions. We know that there were English observers, British observers that were
Yes.
looking at the American Civil War in horror. Is
Yes.
there anything that stands out to you from any of those anecdotes, looking at the Civil War and saying, what are you doing?
Oh, there's an excellent book by I think it was Lieutenant Arthur Wilson of the British Army, writing in 1864, and he mentions with abject horror what's going on with these volunteer armies that in the United States that have these weapons, and in many cases actually had P-53 Enfield rifles, the second most used rifle musket of the American Civil War. And the Confederates even had the British ammunition. And even so, they're getting within 140 yards and pasting each other or squirreling away into trenches. But in abject horror at what the volunteer armies were in the United States and the Confederate States were doing. And this even gave more impetus to the British volunteer movement, the volunteer rifleman movement, that we can't be like them. We have to know these weapons and be able to shoot it at very long ranges. And the mid to late 1860s is also the time the volunteer rifle movement starts to veer away from being a real military, a corps of riflemen that would be called up as a reserve to support the British Army in the event of invasion, to more of a gentleman's shooting club.
Quite.
But still, I mean, if you've got an army, if you've got 100,000 gentlemen that can, that can pop a Frenchman from 700 to 800 yards, if the French invasion army is trying to march through the enclosures of England, I would not want to be in their shoes. But the British observers and the accounts of the American Civil War battles were horrifying to the British, and not just in the sense of the bloodshed, but in the incompetence of these armies of volunteers just slaughtering each other. And a lot of historians
and the
ask,
mistakes don't just come from the volunteers.
yeah, a lot of historians wonder, why didn't the European observers take back the lessons of the trenches of Petersburg or of Atlanta, if Hood should have held the trenches, but instead of charging out sword in hand to lose another appendage. But why didn't the European observers take these lessons back and apply them, and why was World War I such a shock to them? Many historians have asked. And I would argue the reason is the Europeans looked at these armies of untrained volunteers just slaughtering each other at close range and disregarded them as, this is militia fighting militia. Just
Rustics.
Citizenry. And by so doing, they did miss several important lessons. Probably the most important lesson of the American Civil War, tactically, was the employment of rifled artillery, which was adopted and used to great extent. But so far as infantry with musketry, it was, you could say, disregarded as rustic militia, just slaughtering each other wholesale. And of course the Europeans, the Germans and the French and the Russians are watching this and thinking, well, we don't have to worry about this because we have very large professional standing armies. We don't need to depend on this levy in mass of volunteers who don't know the first thing about soldiering. But
Now,
yes,
here's this last question to sum up, and for patriotic reasons, you can give a very diplomatic answer. 1862, would you choose a British regiment or an American regiment, head to head? Or maybe we should talk about that another day.
Yeah, no, just a generic regiment. Like if you took the sum average of
Take Her Majesty's 44th of the line.
Her Majesty's 44th Foot against what's the American regiment?
Give them a professional regiment. One of the regiments out of the professional army. Experienced soldiers.
So like the first U.S.
Sure,
country.
absolutely.
No, I'm British. Hands down.
All right. Well, you've seen that. Her Majesty's soldiers soldier on. Thank you for bearing with us as we pedantically unpack a Wikipedia article. Mr. Guelzo, we would love to talk to you someday. And hopefully this, again, brought to light a little bit more about the rifle-musket in the 19th century. The principles of musketry, and some interesting topics in military history in the Victorian period.
That was fun.
Thank you.